Now I'd like to introduce you to Brett van Rensberg. He's the sales director at IOCO, and he'll be discussing security operation excellence, building security by design into company culture. Brett, looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about that. I know you're big into trout fishing, but let's go over into the security situation and see what we should think about when we're designing security for our corporate networks. Over to you. Thanks, Brett.
Sure, thanks, Mark. Yeah, a cold, chilly Monday morning. Feel like I should be out fishing, but happy to be here and running through some security culture questions and a short slide deck we put together. The reason as IOCO we've picked this topic is we feel it's one that's critical in today's landscape. We've all experienced the change that COVID has brought to our organizations and our enterprises, and it's come with a fundamental shift in how we facilitate security within those environments. But what maybe the employees and our customers, what they don't fully understand is what that means from a company culture point of view, because there's been a huge shift in that space too. And therefore we think this topic is a critical one as companies try to make decisions along the lines of their future, and as they invest in the right security postures, ensuring that they get the culture right along with the designs and technologies they adopt is going to be critical. And I wanted to start a little bit around why this is so critical today. And the major reasoning is just because that surface area has really increased. When users sat at home behind when they sat in the office behind a firewall, it was very easy to control, much easier to control what was coming in and out of your network and coming in and out of your corporate environment. Today, that surface area is spread. Your users are working from coffee shops and on airplanes and at home. And all of a sudden, you're not able to have them sit easily behind that single firewalling infrastructure. And therefore, there's a lot more to manage. And then we've seen it. I mean, looking at the bubbles and the stats, you're seeing huge malware increases in the last year and a half. Same with ransomware. From a Google registered phishing attack, the number of sites that have increased is just massive worldwide. And finally, organizations that are now coming out openly and saying their experience around attempts within their organizations and the vulnerabilities that are being exposed is a hugely increasing number over the last 24 months. So this is not a made up statistic. We know that companies are more at risk today than they ever were. And if they're just going to focus on technologies and what they deploy into the environment, they're going to leave a fundamental portion of the conversation out. And that's the culture you've got to build in line with that posture that you're building at a technology level. And we find companies that are getting this right are those that are educating the users. It's not simply about putting a firewall down or deploying software. It's about having the conversation with your employees and helping them understand that if they're going to expose themselves when sitting at home, if they're going to share information over email, or they're going to open emails they shouldn't open, all of a sudden that risk is much higher than it was yesterday. And therefore, throughout this conversation, we're going to touch base on the cultural components of what building a proper security DNA looks like. But unfortunately, for those companies out there that are looking at security, there is a fundamental technology shift as well. Things have changed, and you've got to look at the technology stack. As I mentioned earlier, it's not as simple as a firewall in a centralized environment and managing that firewall. Today, your users are absolutely everywhere, and therefore you've got to make sure your security is absolutely everywhere. And I think as South Africans and Africans, we've often found that we tend to dip our toe when it comes to technologies. We like to be very cautious about adopting them, whether that's off the back of the economy or that's just how we are as decision makers. That's certainly how it's been. What COVID's done for us is it's really sped the process up. Companies don't have the luxury of time anymore. They've been forced to make decisions, and the original or first lockdown is a great example of that. Users went from working in the office day to day, 8 to 5, to being sent home days later and having to function in the same manner that they did previously. And I think first and foremost, companies looked at things like connectivity, ensuring that users could actually get online. They looked at telephony and calling. These were the initial components. But what's come off the back of that is the security component, because now simple VPN tunnel into a firewall is just not enough to secure that user. And therefore, we've seen the rise of SASE. I mean, acronyms in our world are a dime a dozen, but I think everybody in this space listening to this presentation is going to understand what SASE is. And often it's confused with zero trust networking, which is just a component of it. But I think what's critical around the SASE conversation is it's really pushing that security posture, to the edge of your network. So if you think about those users that are working from home or coffee shop or on an airplane or in a hotel, this is ensuring that that security that you're trying to create follows them everywhere they go. And there's some great components built into it around secure edge gateway, CASB. It manages your applications and performance. But the most critical portion of this is it's protecting your organization's data from an inbound and outbound point of view. And that's why SASE's become so critical in the conversation. Now, again, SASE is a technology, so we've got to be cautious not to put all our cards behind just the technology. It's important that we educate our users around how we use it, ensuring that it's licensed correctly, that they're interacting with the SASE license correctly, and that they're not exposing themselves in places where they potentially still could be. So that's that cultural component coming in. And I worked with a company recently who did a fantastic a video log, which they created on the company's intranet, and they shared that. And all of the users had to go through that video log to not only understand what SASE was and what it was doing for them, but importantly to understand how they interact with it and what they should and shouldn't be sharing. And that moves us into something that's been around a very long time. I think when you talk about advisory in the security space, most companies go, we've been there, we've done it, we've had the conversation. For me personally, and as IOCO, we believe advisory has become more critical than ever. Whenever you see a shift in how something's done, people are trying to understand it. Organizations are trying to understand what that shift really means for them. And today, again, advisory and vulnerability testing and pen testing more critical than ever, because as an organization, you can't afford to make the wrong decision. You can't afford to invest in the wrong space, in the wrong technology. And we're trying to also decide how long this new normal is going to live for. As an organization today sitting in a semi-lockdown, we don't know if we're going to have our users back in the office in 3 or 6 months' time, what's going to happen in a year's time. So if you make the wrong decision around the types of technology you adopt from a security point of view, you could be double or triple investing. And we know no organization wants to get that right. Where this has also become very critical is understanding what's trending within your network. So from a vulnerability and pen testing point of view, it's very important that organizations look into that environment. You can't simply deploy that security layer and 3 years later be sure that it's the same or you're as protected as you were 2 or 6 months ago, because that's not going to be the case. As we've shown in the first slide, those hackers out there, those individuals trying to get in your organization, they're progressing every day. They're finding new ways in. And therefore, you need to ensure that from a technology point of view, from a security point of view, that you're progressing and advancing with that and staying on the bleeding edge. So we find that this has become a large component of what IOCO are doing in the market. And it's more around having the conversation and ensuring that you're pointing in the right direction and you continue to point in the right direction. So as an organization today, don't write off advisory. It's still incredibly important. And then probably one of the most overused phrases in South Africa over the last couple of years has been the single pane of glass. We've used it around networking. We've used it around the cloud. I think my wife would probably want to use it to ensure that she's got a single pane of glass to look into everything I'm doing. But where it has become very, very key for organizations when it comes to security is you can no longer get away with a single technology. If we look at the likes of FortiGate and we look at the likes of Checkpoint and we look at the likes of Palo Alto, these are all great security stacks. But they'll openly admit they're not the silver bullet. They can't cover everything in that world. And therefore, you've got software players coming out and you've got advisory players coming out. And there's just so much scope within the security space. So the more you secure your environment, the more likely you are to adopt more technologies. And therefore, the complexity grows. And we know as corporates, we've tried to steer away from complexity. But ultimately, when you're securing your corporate or enterprise environment, that might not be completely possible. And therefore, the single pane of glass conversation comes to the forefront again. You need some way or some picture that shows you your entire footprint in a very simplistic view so that you can manage it correctly. And again, this is where we're seeing the likes of SIEM and SOC environments come through. I think it's important to find these environments that are integratable or multi-product integratable, because that road that we spoke about is continuously changing, and therefore the culture and DNA of your security organization is going to change. And the more flexible you make yourselves in this space, the better it's going to stand you in the long run. And therefore, the SIEM and SOC conversation is a great way to find that single pane of glass. It's a good way to look at DDoS attacks. It's a good way to look at endpoint security, perimeter security, clustering. It's a great way to look at your SASE environment because you can pull it all into a single picture and start creating trend analysis around what's happening in that environment. And then it flips you back to advisory. When you've got all that information, what do you do with it? Because most individuals in an IT environment don't fully understand it. It's good to have the information, but what in the world do you do with it? That's where you lean on those advisory partners to help assist and give you some level of direction of where you should be spending your time and money to ensure that your environment's protected. So I've thrown a couple of catchphrases at you. Hopefully I haven't put you off with them. I wanted to try and make them a little bit more exciting, but it's critical today. As you look at your organization, look at the technology stack, make sure that you're looking after that enterprise organization that you're looking after, but importantly, build the security culture with your users so they understand the importance of being protected when they work from home. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thanks very much. Very interesting and insightful presentation. And I think the importance of how the landscape's changed in the last 12 to 18 months, it can't be overemphasized, especially from a security point of view. The threats just mount, and honestly, it's become a landscape that's a lot more complex than it used to be, with everybody working from home or working from anywhere. Also, the concept of advisory, where the actual users, they really need the expertise of companies like IOCO to give them a sense of what are other companies doing and how they're solving the problems. So Brett, thanks for those insights. Very, very useful. I've seen some questions coming in the meantime, and I'd like to just encourage the audience to keep them coming in. There is a raffle winner that's waiting, or raffle that can be won from the Q&A. The tab is there. Please use it. The first one that's coming, Brett, it says here, you've mentioned a number of product features related to security. Are these available through a single technology stack, or is it a multiple cloud-based or appliance or hybrid perspective that we're talking about? Over to you, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's a very good question. I alluded to it in the presentation. I think we're seeing some of the major players, the likes of FortiGate, Checkpoint, Palo Alto, stand up and build on their security stacks. We're seeing acquisitions in that space. We're seeing a lot of expansion. Unfortunately, I think from a security environment point of view, as it stands today, it's just far too broad. There are too many areas of the board that you're trying to cover it with a single technology stack. And therefore, the question is quite well positioned because it starts to talk to software-based product sets as well as cloud-based product sets. And I think your answer probably lies somewhere in the middle there. Depending on the size and nature of your organization, you're going to require some sort of physical environment, if not physical, shifting into that cloud, private cloud, hyperscaler type environment. And then the software layer has become more and more critical today. We're seeing the likes of Zscaler, we're seeing the likes of Netscope come to the forefront of security and securing the edge of your network, which a few years ago was really a secondary or tertiary conversation. So I think the answer in short is that if you're an organization of size and you want to understand where to go have that advisory conversation. And it's likely that through that consultation, you're going to land somewhere in the middle. There's going to be some physical tin involved. There's going to be some physical environment involved. But I would almost guarantee that there's going to be a software and cloud-based environment. And then across that stack, put it together. Have a look at the likes of that single pane of glass through a SIEM, a SOC. Look at your service integrators. They've got great environments to pull that whole conversation together and help you understand what's really going on.
Thanks, Brett. I think that's the whole cloud hybrid issue is definitely something we're seeing in our research. As part of how do you secure this multifaceted environment. So I think thanks for that response. I'm just looking, the second question's coming. The question goes, we were happy with our security posture while working at the office, as we were all behind a firewall. We've now effectively increased our surface attack, and you've mentioned 100-fold due to remote workers. But they've been using a VPN client for connectivity back into their office space. So the question then is, how do we reassess where we are now to understand what vulnerabilities we need to look at and how to prioritize these?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Another good question. So, yeah, I think organizations had a little bit of a false sense of security previously. Not to say that all organizations were exposed, but I think where organizations centralized their network behind a firewall, they thought that was the be all and end all. And to a large degree, it worked. So I'm not surprised this shift has exposed their surface area just logically by the users being out and about and not sitting behind that security environment. You've got that challenge. Looking at the ways in which to deal with that, I think mobility works here to stay, whether we like it or not. This new normal, we keep speaking of this other catchphrase that's come along. I think a lot of that is going to be how organizations feel they want their culture to be. In us, by way of example, we want that hybrid workforce. We want to give you some of that flexibility, but we also want to be able to maintain our culture. And to achieve that, or to achieve a mobile workforce, you've got to look at software-based products. You've got to be looking at the likes of Zscaler, Netscope, Pulse, Symantec, and see what they're doing within their stacks and how that fits back. I think what's important in that space, again, is that advisory layer. There are monster differences between these product sets, and within a single product set, you've got multiple tick boxes, and you might not need everything out of a single product set. So I think understanding what lives in that product set will give you that security posture at the edge. And then again, importantly, I'm going to go back to the culture of building a proper security DNA. There's no use just having the security software at the edge if your users are being irresponsible with your company data. You've got to build that culture in line with that software-based protection. So yeah, that would be my answer there. And again, a little punt for the integrators. I think the integrators are doing a great job in the space. They're able to have these consultative conversation, and a number of them are agnostic in their approach. So they're going to advise across different product sets, which is always going to be beneficial for the client. So I think those are the conversations organizations should be looking to have while trying to understand the future landscape.
That makes a lot of sense. So, if I look at IOCO and your partners in the channel, as it were, you're dealing with everybody from big banks right down to manufacturing organizations and government entities. And when you're having that insight, it can give you a lot of best practices, ways of doing things most effectively, which you then can apply to a specific client's requirement. So that's that again, back to that advisory point you made earlier, Brett.